Inbreeding isn't just for medieval footnotes and dusty family trees. It built empires. Behind every crown jewel lies a bloodline knotted into itself, stitched together with cousin vows and royal signatures. These weren't accidents. They were policies. Tonight we peel back the velvet curtain on 33 British royals who married their own, first cousins, second cousins, even siblings-in-law, not for love, but for legacy. The faces you thought you knew? They were family. Twice over. This isn't history. It's genetic strategy. Welcome to the most intimate, uncomfortable dynasty on Earth. Before we dive headfirst into royal entanglements, make sure you're subscribed. It helps keep the family tree branching. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Singapore? We're tracking timelines and bloodlines. 1. Queen Victoria. It is perhaps the most Victorian of ironies that the woman who lent her name to an age of sexual repression, moral rigidity, and tight corsetry married her cousin. Queen Victoria, the empress of half the globe and self-appointed moral compass of the Western world, was head over heels for Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her first cousin, not second cousin, not some obscure Bavarian nobleman twice removed. First cousin. Victoria met Albert when she was 17, or rather, she was introduced to him again. Because this wasn't some romantic twist of fate, but an orchestrated dynastic checkbox. Their shared grandmother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, would have approved. Or perhaps simply nodded from whatever candlelit portrait she haunted, pleased that yet another family tree was folding neatly into itself like a napkin. But here's the twist. Victoria didn't just marry Albert because it was politically advantageous or expected of her. She fell in love with him. Actually, terrifyingly, love. Obsessive, operatic, diary-scrawling love. "My dearest Albert," she wrote after their engagement, "was so affectionate, so beautiful, so pure, so genetically familiar." Albert was hesitant at first, probably because he understood what marrying Victoria meant, not just emotionally, but genetically. The Coburgs had already been tying knots into their lineage for generations, and Albert was no stranger to the risks. But Victoria proposed to him, because of course, as queen, only she could. He said yes. And thus began one of the most intense love affairs in royal history, and one of the most quietly alarming family breeding programs in modern monarchy. Their shared ancestry was more than just a fluke of royal matchmaking. It was part of a broader strategy, an intentional feedback loop of genetics designed to keep power within the family. The Habsburgs had already tested the limits of this, with famously unfortunate results. The British were playing their own game, polite, subtle, but just as determined. Over the years, Victoria and Albert would have 9 children, each of them future royals, future matches, future complications. The family tree didn't branch out, it looped, and that loop would ripple out across Europe. Their children married into the royal houses of Russia, Germany, Spain, Norway, and Sweden. Victoria would become known, with both admiration and a touch of morbid irony, as the grandmother of Europe. But that genetic love letter came with postage due. Several of her descendants would suffer from hemophilia, a then mysterious bleeding disorder passed through the X chromosome. One of the deadliest genetic time bombs to ever tick inside the royal womb. Her son Leopold died young. Her great-grandson, Alexei Romanov of Russia, would bleed in secret, the imperial heir in constant peril from the inside out. Victoria, unknowingly or not, had unleashed a hereditary curse under the guise of affection. And yet, the public narrative was romance, duty, destiny, the great love of the century. No one printed pamphlets about cousin chromosomes. They printed commemorative teacups. But beneath the lace and mourning veils, beneath the marble busts and the operatic declarations of eternal devotion, was the quiet reality of a gene pool more like a gene puddle, and the strange, tragic beauty of a queen who confused love with legacy and never questioned the family resemblance. Which brings us to Albert, the man she loved like no other, the cousin, the consort, the architect of the royal family's public image, and perhaps its most careful planner. 2. Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria. If Queen Victoria was the heart of the Victorian age, Prince Albert was its quietly calculating spine. Equal parts moral compass, architectural enthusiast, and royal breeding strategist. He was the cousin who said, yes, then spent the rest of his life trying to fix the institution from the inside out. Genetically, politically, and metaphorically. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was born into the same intricate knot of minor German nobility that produced half of Europe's royal families and most of their problems. From the moment of his birth, Albert was groomed not for greatness exactly, but for usefulness. He wasn't the heir to a great throne. He was a spare part in a dynastic machine. And then there was Victoria. Their shared grandmother made them first cousins. Their bloodlines made them compatible in the same way identical puzzle pieces are, redundant, but neat. When he was summoned to Kensington Palace at the tender age of 20, he was keenly aware of what was being asked of him. This wasn't a courtship. It was a soft conscription into the British royal family, as breeding stock, moral reformer, and emotional caretaker to a queen who ruled the world but could barely tolerate being contradicted. Still, Albert had his own ambitions. He believed in modernization, in steam, in clean water and urban planning and education for the lower classes. And most of all, he believed in the monarchy, or at least the version of it he could shape from behind the throne. But none of that overshadowed the strange intimacy at the core of their union, an intimacy made stranger by the shared blood. Victoria adored him with a ferocity that was borderline obsessive. She wrote about him with a giddy, almost adolescent infatuation, describing him in her journals as beautiful, perfect, and angelic. She loved his mind, yes, but also his hair, his eyes, his shoulders. It's the kind of infatuation usually reserved for the characters of Gothic romance novels. The twist here was that her lover was also her cousin. Albert, in contrast, was more reserved, a fact that likely saved the empire. Where Victoria was emotional and erratic, Albert was measured and methodical. He introduced reforms, organized the Great Exhibition, designed royal residences, and tried to wrangle the sprawling chaos of the monarchy into a functioning brand. Behind the scenes, he helped orchestrate the marriages of their children, all of whom were carefully placed into other royal families, not for love, but for strategic consolidation. In many ways, Albert expanded the very same cousin marriage model he had stepped into. Only now, it wasn't just British, it was European. By the time of his death, which Victoria would mourn with dramatic flair for the rest of her life, Albert had accomplished something almost mythic. He'd turned a cousin marriage into a continent-wide dynasty, and yet the irony was unavoidable. The same genetic focus that made the royal family so tightly knit also sowed the seeds for its hereditary decline. Hemophilia, infertility, and psychological instability quietly threaded through the noble houses like whispered rumors. Albert didn't just marry into the family, he designed its future. And that future would carry his signature, his symmetry, and his selective inbreeding. But not everyone in the dynasty would be so quiet or so controlled. The next royal in line had a stiffer jaw, a stricter sense of duty, and a bloodline that was already beginning to show its age, genetically and politically. Enter George V. If you're still with us after Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's gene-sharing honeymoon, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Don't forget to subscribe. This dynasty of dysfunction isn't slowing down anytime soon. And let us know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you listen? Midnight, noon, or somewhere in between, we're building a global timeline of royal watchers. 3. George V. George V is what happens when centuries of royal matchmaking produce a man who looks less like a monarch and more like a very stern stamp. With his clipped mustache, stiff collar, and icy sense of duty, George was the walking embodiment of royal austerity, all posture, no performance. He didn't dazzle, he didn't charm, he simply endured. And that, in its own way, made him one of the most effective monarchs of the early 20th century. But behind his starched uniform and imperial indifference was a marriage that carried the quiet legacy of dynastic inbreeding, and a family web as tangled as his whiskers. In 1893, George married Princess Mary of Teck. The union was convenient, respectable, and, in time-honored tradition, familial. Mary was George's second cousin once removed. She was also the former fiancée of his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, whose sudden death left both the throne and Mary without a future. What followed was not so much a love story as a royal salvage operation. Mary was still considered a solid dynastic match, a blend of noble blood, Protestant decorum, and impeccable ancestry. So the solution? Reassign her to the next available Windsor. There was no scandal, no whispers, just a polite pivot, as if swapping romantic partners within the family was no more unusual than rearranging a dinner seating chart. George was never accused of being passionate, about anything really, but he did grow to care deeply for Mary. Theirs was a relationship rooted not in desire, but in discipline, in long walks, mutual silences, and a shared belief in the dignity of duty. If Victoria and Albert were a candle burning at both ends, George and Mary were a pair of well-polished andiron brackets, holding up the fading flame of empire. But even in their domestic respectability, the royal family's genetic choices were quietly catching up with them. George V, like his grandmother Victoria, inherited and passed on the silent codes of Europe's interconnected thrones. His children, particularly the future Edward VIII and George VI, would wrestle with the psychological pressures of their lineage. Their anxieties, neuroses, and stubborn moral rigidity didn't come from nowhere. They were incubated in a palace built on generations of selective familiarity. And while George tried to steer the monarchy into modernity, changing the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor during World War I to distance them from their German roots, the irony was inescapable. The blood was still the same. The cousins still married each other. The name changed. The DNA didn't. George himself was the product of intertwined houses, his marriage another quiet echo of a long-standing royal tradition. Marry within, preserve the bloodline, and hope the jawline doesn't get too sharp. He didn't question it. He embodied it. By the time of his death in 1936, George had ruled through war, revolution, and the slow crumble of empire. But what he left behind wasn't just a crown. It was a family that had perfected the art of noble repetition, genetically, emotionally, historically. And Mary of Teck? She wasn't just the queen consort. She was another familiar face in the royal loop. A cousin, a continuity, and a quiet keeper of bloodlines that refused to thin out. 4. Queen Mary, Mary of Teck. Queen Mary, known to history as Mary of Teck, and to her contemporaries as the walking embodiment of porcelain discipline, was a woman caught between two mirrors, the illusion of tradition and the cold reality of dynastic recycling. She was composed, calculating, and utterly unshakable, the kind of woman who never blinked in a portrait, never laughed in public, and never once apologized for marrying her dead fiancé's brother. Born in 1867 to the Teck branch of the royal web, a German-English tangle of minor nobility and major ambition, Mary was royal enough to matter, but not quite royal enough to stand on her own. Her father, the Duke of Teck, was morganatic, meaning he had noble blood, but not the right to pass it down. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of George III. This made young Mary an acceptable match for the British throne, as long as nobody squinted too hard at the family tree. Originally betrothed to Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, and George V's older brother, Mary was poised to become queen through the usual process. Smile politely, marry your second cousin once removed, and birth a few heirs before tea. But Albert Victor died suddenly in 1892, throwing both the succession and Mary's future into limbo. For a moment, it seemed she might vanish into the royal mist, like so many surplus princesses before her. But the crown, ever efficient when it came to bloodlines, simply reassigned her. Within a year, Mary was engaged to Prince George, Albert Victor's younger brother, and the new heir apparent. It was a practical move, but not a heartless one. Mary and George were said to have grown fond of each other. Fond being the operative word, a term that evokes warm wallpaper rather than passion. Their marriage was, by all outward appearances, a success. They produced 6 children, maintained a famously formal household, and never once allowed a scandal to surface uninvited. But what's more intriguing is what their union represented. A kind of genetic continuity. Mary, through her mother, was a descendant of George III, and George V, through his father, was as well. Their children, then, were not just heirs to a throne, but echoes of a single bloodline, folded inward. Mary wasn't naive about this. She understood the game. Her entire life was a study in calculated presentation, the pearls, the posture, the carefully curated silences. She collected furniture, jewelry, and ceremonial routines the way other people collect grudges. Methodically, with a deep appreciation for legacy. She preserved the past because she was part of it, stitched into the same ancestral fabric she so rigidly upheld. And yet beneath the flawless veneer was a paradox. Mary, the symbol of unshakable Britishness, was herself a product of continental entanglement, German ancestry, cousin marriage pedigree, and a last name, Tech, that the crown quietly buried after the Great War. Her identity was rewritten, repackaged, and draped in Union Jacks. But the blood told another story, one of closeness, of lineage over individuality, of a system that kept cycling through its own gene pool, smiling all the while. Her children would bear the emotional cost of this closeness. Edward VIII would abdicate. George VI would stutter under the weight of inherited pressure, and the monarchy would brace itself for a century of change. But Mary? She held steady, steely, serene, and thoroughly inbred. A queen consort twice connected by blood, married into her own family tree like a carefully grafted branch, and her legacy would carry on in her granddaughter, a young woman named Elizabeth, who would follow the family script so faithfully that she, too, would marry her cousin. 5. Elizabeth II. She ruled longer than any monarch in British history, outlasted 13 prime ministers, and became the face of an empire that slowly faded behind her. Yet for all her composure, Queen Elizabeth II began her reign, and her marriage, with a decision that was far older than the crown itself. She married her cousin. Yes, the most iconic royal of the modern era, the woman who became a symbol of continuity, stability, and carefully worded Christmas speeches, entered adulthood the old-fashioned way, by marrying someone from within the family line. Her husband, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, was her third cousin through Queen Victoria and her second cousin once removed through Christian IX of Denmark. 2 overlapping branches on the same European family vine. Not scandalous necessarily, just historically predictable. Because in the royal house, love often comes with a family resemblance. The romance began before Elizabeth was even a teenager. She met Philip when she was just 13 during a visit to the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, where Philip, 5 years her senior, was training. By all accounts, she was smitten almost immediately. From that point on, she wrote to him regularly. Her interest didn't waver even as advisors grumbled. He was foreign, He was brash. He was practically broke. But most importantly, he wasn't a complete outsider. He was, as always, related. Their shared lineage made the match dynastically neat. Their great-great-grandmother was Queen Victoria. Their mutual ancestor, Christian IX of Denmark, was nicknamed the father-in-law of Europe for a reason. The royal family didn't just intermarry for power anymore. By the 20th century, it was habit. A kind of ancestral muscle memory. Elizabeth's marriage to Philip was a stabilizing gesture after the chaos of war. Britain needed continuity, familiarity, something reassuringly old-fashioned. And what could be more traditional than marrying a cousin? To the public, they were a golden couple, young, photogenic, and poised to usher in a new era. But behind the formal portraits and carefully staged appearances was a family structure that had barely evolved since the 1800s. The bloodlines remained tight. The House of Windsor, newly renamed to distance itself from its Germanic roots, was still, in many ways, an echo chamber of its own ancestry. Over the decades, Elizabeth's reign would be marked by careful navigation through modernity, television appearances, political neutrality, grandchildren marrying commoners. But the foundation remained the same. Her own marriage was the quiet proof. The monarchy was still, quite literally, keeping it in the family. What's often overlooked is that this closeness wasn't just ceremonial. It shaped the personalities, pressures, and even health concerns of those born into it. The psychological toll of living in an institution built on shared DNA, where everyone is both a relative and a rival, became more visible as time went on. And yet, Elizabeth never flinched. She carried the burden like a perfectly balanced handbag. Her emotional reserve, her refusal to complain, her lifelong performance of duty, all of it masked a reality that hadn't changed in centuries. She was the product of a closed system, a woman born into a lineage that prized continuity over individuality. But if Elizabeth was the living embodiment of royal restraint, her husband Philip was something else entirely. A Navy man, a disruptor, a distant cousin with a dry wit and a sharp tongue. And he wasn't just her partner. He was another chapter in the family tradition that kept the crown close, and the bloodlines even closer. 6. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip was a contradiction in motion, an exile in royal blue, a distant cousin turned consort, and a man whose DNA came with enough royal cross-stitching to confuse a genealogist. Born on a kitchen table in Corfu and shuffled through Europe like a diplomatic chess piece, Philip's life was a testament to royal survival, self-reinvention, and ancestral recycling. His full title at birth was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, a mouthful that came with more dynastic connections than actual stability. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, was the son of King George III of Greece, who confusingly was born a Danish prince, and his mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. That made Philip and Elizabeth third cousins through Victoria, and second cousins once removed through Christian IX of Denmark, two bloodlines colliding in one crisp naval uniform. Philip's early life was a tangle of displacement. After a military coup in Greece, his family fled the country, smuggling the infant prince out in a makeshift crib fashioned from an orange crate. The romance of it all fades slightly when you realize that many of the royal houses watching his family collapse were also his relatives. Educated in France, Germany, and Britain, Philip grew up with multiple accents and no fixed national identity, a royal citizen of nowhere. But despite the uncertainty, he carried something else with him, an unspoken understanding of the system he was born into. Royal marriages were not just personal. They were biological strategy. In Philip's world, family trees weren't sprawling oaks. They were tightly pruned topiaries, meticulously shaped for appearance and inheritance. So when he began courting Princess Elizabeth, his distant cousin, he wasn't just stepping into love, he was stepping into legacy. His German background raised eyebrows, especially so soon after World War II. His sisters had married German princes, some with problematic associations. But Philip did what was required. He renounced his foreign titles, adopted the anglicized surname Mountbatten, converted to Anglicanism, and became a British subject. The family resemblance, however, remained, on paper and in blood. Their 1947 wedding was treated as a fairy tale. A nation recovering from war finally had something to celebrate. But beneath the pageantry was a quiet, familiar truth. The monarchy had once again kept things in the family. It wasn't just tradition, it was design. Philip, for his part, brought a kind of blunt vitality to the royal fold. He was outspoken, often inappropriate, and always several steps ahead of the stifling decorum that defined his adopted court. But his role was deeply paradoxical. He was both a modernizer and a traditionalist, a distant cousin and a lifelong support. His identity was an echo, shaped by the very dynastic ties that had hemmed him in. And yet, for all his resistance to protocol, he remained loyal to its structure. His children, like his marriage, were born of two converging royal lines, tight-knit, rehearsed, and ancestrally layered. The House of Windsor had modernized its image, but its core structure hadn't changed. Philip simply played the part, the cousin, the consort, the contradiction. And while he bristled at sentiment, his life spoke volumes about the cost of royal proximity, not just emotionally, but biologically. Because before modern marriage brought new blood into the fold, the old rules still governed the palace. As Henry VIII would remind everyone, sometimes with a crown, and sometimes with a widow. 7. Henry VIII. There's a peculiar kind of symmetry in the way Henry VIII treated marriage like war and family like property. Most people remember him as the king with 6 wives, 2 beheadings, and 1 catastrophic religious schism. But before the split from Rome and the trail of discarded queens, there was something far more medieval and oddly intimate at the heart of his romantic decisions. He married his sister-in-law. When Henry wed Catherine of Aragon in 1509, he wasn't just taking a politically advantageous Spanish princess as his queen. He was marrying the widow of his own brother, Arthur. Catherine and Arthur had been wed as teenagers in a strategic alliance between Spain and England. But Arthur died only months after the wedding, of illness, likely, not divine intervention, though the latter would have made things easier to explain. What followed was a complicated ecclesiastical maneuver to clear the way for Henry to take Catherine as his own bride. The Bible, it turned out, had conflicting opinions about such arrangements. One verse condemned marrying a brother's wife. Another encouraged it, if the brother had died childless. A moral paradox, sealed with a papal bull. With enough lobbying and royal pressure, Pope Julius II granted the dispensation, declaring the union acceptable. Henry married Catherine at 17. She was 23, and already family. At first, the marriage was affectionate, even loving. Henry called her his dearest wife, and they shared a mutual respect rooted in status, intellect, and shared bloodlines. Because this wasn't just about Arthur. Catherine and Henry were also related in other, more distant ways. Royal families always were. Their union was dynastically circular, a continuation of cousin marriages going back generations. But beneath the courtly dances and religious pageantry was a slow-burning tension. Catherine failed to produce a surviving male heir. Multiple pregnancies ended in tragedy or stillbirth. Only one daughter, Mary, survived. And for Henry, a man obsessed with continuity, masculinity, and legacy, this was not just a disappointment. It was a crisis. Over time, the marriage unraveled. But what's curious isn't just how it fell apart, but how Henry used their family connection to justify the split. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, he began insisting the union had been cursed from the start, that marrying his brother's widow was an affront to God. The very dispensation he'd once fought for became the legal foundation for tearing everything down. It's revisionism at its most royal. The problem wasn't the familial tie, he now argued. It was the lack of divine favor. No sons, no blessing. Therefore, no valid marriage. Never mind that he'd known Catherine since she was a teenager, or that they'd lived as man and wife for 20 years, or that they were bound by blood before they ever exchanged vows. The irony? Henry used the same familial closeness that had enabled the marriage to claim its invalidity, and when the Pope wouldn't grant an annulment, Henry simply created his own church, with himself at the head, and declared the marriage over. Just like that, faith bent to family, law bent to lineage. But Henry's next romantic entanglement would offer no such legal neatness. Because if Catherine was his sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn was something even murkier, a first cousin through the tangled Howard bloodline. And unlike Catherine, Anne wouldn't go quietly. 8. Catherine of Aragon. History tends to frame her as the wronged first wife, the Spanish Catholic queen who lost her throne to a younger, louder rival. But Catherine of Aragon was far more than a tragic figure in Henry VIII's marital saga. She was the living embodiment of dynastic design, born into power, married into proximity, and trapped in a royal structure that prized bloodlines over autonomy. Long before she became Queen of England, Catherine was already deeply entangled in the European web of cousin marriages and ancestral recycling. Her parents, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, weren't just the Catholic monarchs of Spain. They were also second cousins. That meant Catherine inherited a tightly wound pedigree from the start, one that would only get more claustrophobic when she arrived in England. Her first marriage, at the age of 15, was to Prince Arthur, heir to the English throne and son of Henry VII. It was a politically calculated move, Spain and England uniting through holy matrimony and shared European blood. Arthur, also her distant cousin through shared royal ancestors, was sickly and unimpressive. Their union lasted only 5 months before Arthur died. The logical next step, of course, was to keep the alliance, and the dowry, intact. So Catherine remained in England, living in limbo for nearly 7 years, while her future was debated behind heavy velvet curtains. Finally, with the blessing of Pope Julius II and after significant legal gymnastics, she married Arthur's younger brother Henry, her former brother-in-law, her cousin by descent, and soon the future king. The marriage began with promise. Henry VIII was young, athletic, charming, at least before power distorted him into a caricature of divine authority. Catherine, a seasoned courtier and devout Catholic, brought a regal calm to the chaotic Tudor court. Together, they were a political dream, until they weren't. Catherine's greatest challenge wasn't Henry's wandering attention. It was biology. She bore Henry multiple children, but only one, Mary, survived infancy. In a court obsessed with securing male heirs, Catherine's inability to produce a living son was treated as a cosmic fault line. Henry, always ready to reframe failure as divine injustice, began insisting their marriage had been cursed, that by marrying his brother's widow, even with papal permission, he had offended God. The irony is thick. The same royal system that married them for convenience now condemned them for it. Henry's dynastic paranoia, paired with the crown's long-standing tradition of consanguineous marriages, turned against Catherine. She became the obstacle, the scapegoat, the religious relic standing in the way of progress, or at least of Anne Boleyn. But Catherine refused to step aside. She maintained, to her dying day, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and therefore her marriage to Henry was valid in the eyes of God. Whether or not that was true almost didn't matter. What mattered was her refusal to be erased. She remained queen in her own mind, even as she was exiled from court, separated from her daughter, and replaced by a younger woman whose own family ties were just as incestuous, if not more so. Because Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife and presumed salvation, wasn't just a court beauty. She was family, a Howard by blood, a cousin by marriage, and a queen with her own ancestral entanglements waiting quietly beneath her jeweled neckline. 9. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is often remembered as the original Tudor femme fatale, the cunning courtier who beguiled a king, disrupted a kingdom, and lost her head. But before she was a queen, a symbol, or a cautionary tale, Anne was something more predictably royal, a cousin. The Boleyns weren't nobodies. They were well-placed, ambitious, and deeply embedded in the English aristocracy. Anne's mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from the illustrious Howard family, one of the most powerful and proudly inbred noble dynasties of the time. The Howards had been marrying their cousins since before it was fashionable, and Anne's family tree, like most in the Tudor court, folded inward like origami. Through her Howard lineage, Anne was a first cousin to Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's future fifth wife, and had blood ties to several other noble families that intersected with the monarchy in complex ways. But more directly, Anne and Henry VIII were distant cousins, both descended from King Edward I. Not close enough to cause a diplomatic stir, but close enough to raise an eyebrow in the modern world. When Anne returned from the European courts, first the Netherlands, then France, she arrived at Henry's court as more than a stylish novelty. She was educated, sharp, politically aware, and carrying the kind of noble blood that made her presence acceptable in elite circles. Her foreign polish only added to her intrigue, but her family connections are what gave her staying power. Henry's pursuit of Anne wasn't just about romance, nor was it entirely about lust. It was about legacy. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced no male heir, and Anne, clever enough to know her value, refused to be just another mistress. She wanted the crown, and Henry, besotted and increasingly desperate for a son, was willing to rewrite the kingdom to give it to her. What followed was the royal equivalent of tearing up the user manual. Henry broke with Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and annulled his decades-long marriage to Catherine. All for Anne, the cousin he couldn't live without until he could. Their union was historic, but not unprecedented in its bloodlines. Anne fit neatly into the long-standing tradition of keeping things in the family. Her noble lineage ensured the political legitimacy of any child she might produce, a child Henry believed would finally be his long-awaited son. But Anne gave birth to Elizabeth. A healthy daughter, yes, but a disappointment to a man who'd upended an entire religious order to secure a male heir. Their relationship soured with remarkable speed. And while Anne's fall from grace was shaped by court factions, political maneuvering, and Henry's notoriously short attention span, it's easy to overlook the structural irony. She was replaced by someone less politically controversial, but equally rooted in the same aristocratic gene pool, her cousin Catherine. Howard would eventually wear the same crown. Anne Boleyn's downfall was framed as betrayal, but her rise was a textbook example of dynastic strategy, a noble woman with ancestral ties leveraged into the heart of monarchy. Her story didn't just end with a severed marriage. It rippled outward through her daughter, Elizabeth I, who would rule England with unmatched brilliance and never marry at all, perhaps understanding better than anyone the cost of loving within the family line. But before Anne's daughter could reshape the crown, another Howard girl, young, beautiful, and just as entangled in bloodlines, would enter Henry's orbit. Catherine Howard, a cousin in name, in blood, and in fate. 10. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard arrived at court like a candle flickering in a gusty corridor, bright, beautiful, and terribly exposed. She was young, barely educated, and practically raised in a household that treated nobility like a chaotic boarding school. But what truly made her remarkable in the eyes of history, apart from her tragic end, was how perfectly she fit the royal pattern. Another Howard girl, another cousin, another name written in the margins of the Tudor family script. Born sometime around 1523, Catherine was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son in a noble family stacked with ambition but light on resources. Her mother died young, and Catherine was shuffled off to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a woman whose generosity extended to many wards, but whose supervision was famously lax. It was a noble upbringing in name only, and a breeding ground for courtly disaster. But her bloodline was impeccable. The Howards were among the most powerful families in England, and they had long mastered the art of staying close to the throne, not by war or rebellion, but by marriage. Catherine's cousin, Anne Boleyn, had already worn the crown. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, had his fingers in every major court intrigue. And like so many women in that web of dynastic repetition, Catherine didn't rise by accident. She was placed. She first caught the king's eye in 1540 as a lady-in-waiting to his then-wife, Anne of Cleves. Henry, middle-aged, bloated, and increasingly irritable, saw in Catherine something that reminded him of youth, or at least the memory of it. She was somewhere between 16 and 18. He was nearly 50. The age difference was jarring, but not the most unusual thing about the match. What raised fewer eyebrows, oddly enough, was the family tie. Catherine and Henry were related through shared noble ancestry. She was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, and Anne, of course, had been Henry's second wife. So Catherine entered the marriage not only as a new queen, but as a walking reminder of a former one. A Howard replacement, recycled through the royal courts like a delicate, doomed heirloom. The marriage was swift, secretive, and wildly inappropriate. Henry, besotted once more, called her his rose without a thorn. A charming sentiment, if not for the fact that the Tudor garden was already riddled with vines from the same genetic root system. Catherine wasn't just a symbol of renewed youth. She was a continuation of the same dynastic strategy. Keep the power in the family, even if it meant marrying cousins, nieces, or the ghost of a previous wife. But Catherine's story, like Anne's before her, spiraled into disaster. While Anne had been undone by politics, Catherine's fall was a matter of court gossip and old secrets. Secrets that, once revealed, turned the king's affection into rage. The family that had placed her so carefully into power was nowhere to be found when it crumbled. The Howard name, once again, became a whisper of scandal in the velvet halls of power. Still, Catherine's brief moment as queen wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that in the Tudor world, love was dangerous, youth was disposable, and family ties were a double-edged sword. And as always, when bloodlines twisted too tightly, they frayed. But not all royal cousins ended on the scaffold. One queen took those same dynastic tangles and turned them into a crown of her own. She ruled not as a wife, but as a sovereign. Her name was Mary, and she would marry her cousin too, only this time it would change the fate of nations. 11. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was born into a bloodline already tangled beyond repair, a daughter of the Stuart dynasty, granddaughter of Tudor ambition, and heiress to multiple thrones before she could walk. Her life was the embodiment of royal expectation, geopolitical anxiety, and yet another fateful cousin marriage that would prove to be both strategic and spectacularly self-defeating. From the moment she was born in 1542, Mary was an object of dynastic significance. Her father, James V of Scotland, died mere days after her birth, leaving her queen in name but an infant in reality. Her mother, Mary of Guise, ensured that her daughter's upbringing was steeped in both Catholic tradition and royal strategy. And where better to shape a future queen than the French court, a place where cousin marriages were practically sport and dynasties were treated like wine vintages. Better with age, richer with incest. At 15, Mary married the French dauphin, Francis II, another cousin, of course, this time through their shared descent from the House of Valois. But that marriage was brief. Francis died young, and Mary, now a teenage widow, returned to Scotland in 1561 with a French accent, a Catholic heart, and a dangerous claim to the English throne. But it wasn't her religion or her lineage alone that would ignite political fires. It was her second marriage, to her first cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was tall, attractive, arrogant, and utterly disastrous. He was also, crucially, related to Mary through their shared grandmother, Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. That made their union a dynastic power play with double royal bloodlines. Two claims to the English throne fused into one combustible marriage. From a political standpoint, the match made a kind of dreadful sense. If Mary and Darnley produced a son, that child would be heir not only to Scotland but potentially to England as well. A unifying monarch with Tudor and Stuart blood wrapped into one disturbingly tight genetic bundle. The move threatened Elizabeth I directly, giving Mary a stronger claim to the English crown than ever before. But inside the marriage itself, the real threat was Darnley. He was unstable, jealous, and drunk on the illusion of power. He demanded the crown matrimonial, the right to co-rule with Mary, and when she refused, his resentment turned toxic. In 1566, he was implicated in the murder of Mary's trusted secretary, David Rizzio, an act carried out in front of the pregnant queen herself. Still, despite the violence, Mary stayed. Whether out of duty, calculation, or desperation, she played the part of the queenly wife. Until Darnley was found dead under suspicious circumstances the following year. The details were murky. A house explosion, a body found in the garden, and signs of strangulation. The political fallout was swift. Mary's reputation never recovered. She married again, this time to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man widely believed to have orchestrated Darnley's murder. Whether by choice or coercion, the third marriage sealed her downfall. Nobles rebelled, and Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. But even as she fled to England seeking protection, Mary remained a dynastic threat. Her cousin, Elizabeth I, kept her under house arrest for 19 years, not because of what Mary had done, but because of who she was. A cousin, a Catholic, a royal mirror with just enough shared blood to be dangerous. Mary's story ended behind locked doors, but her legacy endured. Her son would unite the crowns of England and Scotland. Her life, marked by cousin marriages and catastrophic alliances, became a warning and a blueprint. And yet, for all the tragedy, Darnley's story is just as crucial. He wasn't just her cousin and husband. He was a royal firework burning far too close to the fuse. 12. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Henry Stuart, better known by his inherited title Lord Darnley, was tall, charming, musically gifted, and, on paper, every bit the ideal Renaissance prince. But then again, paper doesn't bleed. And when it came to Darnley, the ink of noble pedigree ran thick with cousin marriage, dynastic calculation, and a fatal misunderstanding of power. Darnley was born in 1545 to Matthew Stuart, 4th Earl of Lennox, and Lady Margaret Douglas, herself a niece of Henry VIII. That alone gave Darnley a Tudor bloodline, but his real genetic lottery ticket was his shared ancestry with Mary, Queen of Scots. Through Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII and grandmother to both Mary and Darnley, the two were first cousins. And in the royal world, that made them not just compatible, but politically combustible. When Darnley arrived in Scotland in 1565, Mary saw in him a mirror, not just of blood, but of ambition. The match would unite their claims to the English throne, creating a dynastic powerhouse that could challenge Elizabeth I, who sat nervously on England's throne with no heir and no husband. For Catholic nobles across Europe, Mary and Darnley's marriage promised a restoration of the old order. For Elizabeth, it threatened everything. But within weeks of their union, the dream began to rot. Darnley was, in a word, petulant. He wanted the crown matrimonial, equal rule alongside Mary, and believed that being a husband and cousin to the Queen entitled him to it. When Mary refused, he responded with vanity, drinking, and courtly scheming. He was jealous of her friendships, threatened by her authority, and increasingly paranoid about being sidelined. One of the more infamous episodes in this unraveling marriage was the murder of David Rizzio, Mary's secretary and close confidant. Darnley, convinced that Rizzio wielded inappropriate influence over the Queen, joined a faction of nobles who stormed into Mary's private chambers and had Rizzio assassinated before her eyes. At the time, Mary was several months pregnant. The act wasn't just treacherous. It was dynastically self-sabotaging. Darnley's paranoia had eclipsed his sense of strategy. Yet despite the betrayal, Mary remained with him, at least for a time. She gave birth to their son James in June 1566, the future unifier of the Scottish and English crowns. But by then, their marriage was beyond repair. Darnley's behavior grew erratic. He alienated both Protestant and Catholic nobles, became a liability to the crown, and soon found himself isolated even within his own court. Then came the moment that sealed his place in royal infamy. In February 1567, Darnley was found dead in the garden outside his lodgings in Kirklefield, Edinburgh. The house had exploded, but Darnley's body showed no burns, only signs of possible suffocation. The mystery of his death, accident, assassination, or arranged execution, has never been conclusively solved. The official story shifted with each retelling, but one fact remained clear. His murder cleared the way for Mary's third marriage, to the Earl of Bothwell, the very man suspected of orchestrating Darnley's demise. Whether Mary was complicit, coerced, or catastrophically naive is still debated, but her marriage to her cousin had ended in scandal, suspicion, and the collapse of her reign. Darnley, like so many royals bred too close to power, was a man inflated by his own importance and undone by his lack of insight. His union with Mary was meant to consolidate claims and strengthen legitimacy. Instead, it ignited rebellion, divided kingdoms, and left their son to inherit a throne drenched in accusation. But the pattern wouldn't die with him. The next king, James VI of Scotland, soon to become James III of England, would inherit not just two crowns, but the same dynastic habits. And when he chose a bride, he reached for familiarity. A cousin, of course, just distant enough to be palatable, and close enough to keep the royal bloodline comfortably looping. 13. James Foy. James VI of Scotland. James I of England. Or James VI of Scotland, depending on which side of the border your royal allegiance lay, was many things. A philosopher king with a nervous laugh, a patron of Shakespeare with an obsession for witchcraft, and the first ruler to unify the English and Scottish crowns. But like so many of his forebears, he also followed a family recipe that hadn't changed in centuries. Rule, marry, and reproduce, ideally with someone who already shows up in your family tree. Born in 1566 to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, James entered the world already swimming in genetic symmetry. His claim to both the Scottish and English thrones was backed not by conquest, but by consanguinity. He was the great-grandson of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, on both his mother's and father's sides. A two-lane highway of Tudor blood ran through his veins, and it would shape his reign in more ways than one. By the time he took the English throne in 1603, James had already been King of Scotland for over 3 decades, a reign marked by Protestant consolidation, aristocratic resistance, and a barely concealed fear of being overthrown, poisoned, or worse. Perhaps it's no surprise that when it came time to choose a queen, he went with someone who felt both familiar and diplomatically safe: Anne of Denmark. Anne was his first cousin once removed, a detail that rarely makes it into the celebratory woodcut portraits or Baroque-era biographies. Their shared ancestor, Christian I of Denmark, linked the two royals through the well-worn pathways of intermarried nobility. It was a match that followed the classic blueprint: unite Protestant powers, reinforce dynastic alliances, and keep the bloodline comfortably predictable. The courtship, if it can be called that, was more of a formal arrangement than a love story. Anne was 14 when they were married by proxy in 1589, and James was 23. He didn't even meet her in person until later that year, when he sailed to Norway to collect her after storms delayed her crossing to Scotland. It was not exactly the sweeping romance of fairy tales, but it fit the criteria: noble, royal, and ancestrally appropriate. The marriage was productive in the way royal marriages are meant to be. They had several children, including Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died young, and Charles, who would eventually become Charles I, the king who would lose his head, but not his Habsburg jawline. Anne and James maintained a cordial relationship for most of their marriage, though they often lived apart and quarreled over religion and parenting. What makes James truly fascinating in the dynastic context is not just who he married, but how naturally he inhabited a world where cousin marriage wasn't an exception. It was the rule. He was born of cousins, raised among them, and continued the cycle without hesitation. His political writings, such as The True Law of Free Monarchies, argued that kings were divinely appointed and not subject to human laws, a belief system that pairs neatly with the notion that royal families are above the normal expectations of genetics or biology. And while James cultivated an image of thoughtful kingship, his family life, like his ancestry, was a careful construction of political inheritance and personal caution. Even his selection of a queen followed the unwritten law of noble marriage: keep it in the family, keep it in the church, and above all, keep it predictable. But Anne of Denmark was more than just a dynastic footnote. She played the role of queen consort with elegance and increasing independence, navigating a foreign court, foreign religion, and a husband whose interests often strayed elsewhere. And just like James, she too had royal blood that curled right back to the center of the map. A cousin, a consort, and yet another branch of Europe's tightly pruned dynastic tree. 14. Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark entered the royal stage not with a thunderclap, but with a long diplomatic yawn. A teenage bride from a northern court, shipped south to secure a Protestant alliance, reinforce dynastic ties, and decorate the margins of James VI's political vision. On paper, she was a perfect match: royal blood, Protestant upbringing, and just enough cousin credibility to keep the union safely within the bounds of intermarital tradition. She was James's first cousin once removed, a fact no one seemed especially concerned about at the time, mostly because such unions were the fabric of royal diplomacy. The match wasn't arranged for love, of course, but for religious alignment and political neatness. Her father, Frederick II of Denmark, was a Protestant monarch in an increasingly tense Europe, and James, King of Scotland, and soon to be King of England, was eager to consolidate Protestant power across northern Europe. Anne arrived as a dowry-wrapped olive branch with a distant family resemblance and the right theological affiliations. But if Anne began her royal life as a passive figure, a signature on a treaty in the shape of a girl, she didn't stay that way. Once installed in the Scottish court in 1589, she brought with her a distinct cultural influence, a formidable temperament, and an early taste for independence. Her marriage to James was conventional in structure, but unconventional in emotion. The two shared moments of companionship, even affection, but their relationship was often strained, distant, and complicated by religious disputes and personal differences. The early years were rocky. Anne, a devout Lutheran, had trouble adjusting to the Presbyterian strictness of the Scottish court. Her Danish attendants were viewed with suspicion. Her attempts to assert influence, especially in matters of her children's upbringing, sparked ongoing tensions. She and James famously quarreled over the custody of their firstborn, Prince Henry, with Anne fighting for maternal rights in a court where the father's word, especially when he was the king, was law. Still, Anne carved out her own space. She became a patron of the arts, a lover of mask theater, and a queen who understood the soft power of performance. She surrounded herself with intellectuals, architects, and artists, building her court into a subtle counterbalance to James's theological rigidity. Where he quoted scripture, she commissioned allegories. Where he chased political unity, she curated cultural refinement. And through it all, Anne remained firmly embedded in the same royal bloodlines that had produced, and would continue to produce, monarchs by design rather than deviation. She was not a political outsider. She was dynastic reinforcement. Her ancestry traced back through the same European corridors as James's, their union less an innovation than a continuation of the great royal echo. Marry your cousins, preserve the alliances, and hope the children inherit the best traits in the family's genetic lottery. They did, and didn't. Their son, Charles I, would inherit the throne, the face of a king, and the misfortune of being born into a system that prized divine right over democratic compromise. He would go on to lose his crown and his head, but not his lineage. Because Anne, like so many queens before and after her, gave the monarchy what it wanted: more royals, more heirs, more of the same. And while James ruled the kingdoms with pamphlets and proclamations, Anne ruled quietly through art, lineage, and legacy, another cousin stitched into the royal pattern, a pattern that would echo again in the reign of Richard II, who followed the familiar script by marrying his own cousin, and watching the kingdom slip through his hands anyway. 15. Richard II. Richard II was born into a story already underway, the grandson of Edward III, the son of the Black Prince, and a boy king destined to inherit a crown weighed down by war, family politics, and ancestral ambition. He was 10 years old when he became king in 1377, far too young to understand the throne's true burden. But even as a child, he knew one thing well enough. Royalty meant obligation. And marriage in this world was not about affection. It was about ancestry. So when Richard eventually married Anne of Bohemia, it surprised no one that she was his cousin. Their shared descent from the French royal line through Philip III made them relatives in a genealogical tangle that was, by 14th century standards, not only acceptable but preferable. Cousin marriage wasn't just tolerated. It was an act of dynastic hygiene. If you couldn't keep the crown within your bloodline, you risked spilling it entirely. Anne of Bohemia was a diplomatic match, engineered more for politics than passion. She was the daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, and her brother, Wenceslaus, ruled Bohemia, strategically useful allies for England during its long and bloody conflict with France. There was no dowry, which irked the English court, but Richard was uncharacteristically insistent. He wanted Anne, not just as a wife, but as a symbol. Their marriage in 1382 was met with shrugs and side-eyes from the nobility. She brought no money, no military alliances, and no obvious advantage. What she did bring, however, was calm. Anne was modest, intelligent, and dignified in a court rife with corruption and self-interest. And despite the lack of financial payoff, their marriage appeared, unusually, to be one of mutual respect, perhaps even love. But the political optics remained the same. Another cousin marriage folded into the tapestry of Plantagenet strategy. Anne's bloodline reinforced Richard's continental ties, cementing his image as a cultured monarch, a ruler who preferred poets and painted manuscripts to soldiers and steel. In fact, Richard's reign would become defined less by conquest than by symbolism. He surrounded himself with art, ritual, and a cultivated image of divine kingship that only grew more elaborate and more disconnected as tensions with his nobility escalated. Anne's influence was subtle but steady. She was known to plead for mercy in Richard's more vindictive moments, and her presence often softened his edges. Her death in 1394, from plague likely, left him emotionally shattered. He ordered the demolition of Sheen Palace, where she had died, unable to tolerate the memory. The loss unmoored him, and his already fragile relationship with his court began to splinter further. In the years that followed, Richard's rule became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and authoritarian. He exiled rivals, hoarded power, and alienated even those who had once supported him. Without Anne, his restraint faded, and so did his grasp on the throne. By 1399, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who would become Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. Richard died in captivity, stripped of the symbolic grandeur he had once cloaked himself in. His cousin had taken his throne, and the bloodline that had once legitimized his reign now justified his downfall. The irony, of course, is painfully consistent. The same familial ties that propped up Richard's claim also dismantled it. Marriage to his cousin had served the dynasty. Being overthrown by another cousin served the politics. But Anne of Bohemia, his cousin and consort, had offered him something rarer: brief human companionship in a life otherwise ruled by ancestry and appearance. Her absence left a void the crown couldn't fill. 16. Anne of Bohemia. Anne of Bohemia was never meant to dazzle. She was not a beauty, not a military asset, and in the opinion of many English nobles, not much of a dowry either. But what she lacked in political flash, she made up for with quiet calculation, and the impeccable bloodline of a royal cousin. Born in 1366 to Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, and Elizabeth of Pomerania, Anne was the daughter of one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. She was also, by the time she reached marrying age, a highly eligible piece in the never-ending chess match of dynastic diplomacy. Her marriage to Richard II of England in 1382 wasn't just a convenient alliance between kingdoms. It was yet another chapter in the well-thumbed royal manual of marry your cousin, consolidate the bloodline, try not to let the empire collapse. Through their mutual descent from Philip III of France, Anne and Richard were cousins. A perfectly acceptable arrangement in royal Europe, where marriage outside the extended family tree was considered risky, even suspicious. The union was engineered to secure a military alliance with Bohemia and the broader Holy Roman Empire, or so Richard's advisors hoped. In reality, the match brought no troops, no gold, and no particularly favorable treaties. The English court was unimpressed, but Richard was smitten. His courtship of Anne wasn't just political, it was personal. He saw in her a reflection of his own values: sophistication, piety, a love of art and learning, and a shared disinterest in the gruff martial ethos that had defined his Plantagenet forebears. Their marriage lasted over a decade, and by most accounts, it was affectionate, even tender. A rarity in royal unions, particularly ones forged between cousins whose main job was to produce heirs. Which, incidentally, they didn't. The childlessness of Anne and Richard's marriage became a quiet national anxiety. Without an heir, Richard's already unstable reign teetered even closer to collapse. And yet, unlike so many monarchs before and after him, Richard didn't replace Anne. He didn't seek a new wife. He didn't push her aside. Whether from genuine loyalty or political paralysis, he remained bound to her, and when she died in 1394 at the age of 28, he reportedly wept uncontrollably. He also demolished Sheen Palace, where she had died, declaring that he could never return to the place of her passing. It was a king's grief made literal, architectural, performative, and deeply telling. Anne wasn't just his queen. She was, for Richard, a kind of personal ballast. And once she was gone, his already fragile hold on power unraveled quickly. Without Anne, Richard drifted further into autocracy. His preference for ceremony over statecraft, symbolism over strategy, alienated the nobility. Within 5 years of her death, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV. Once again, the same family that gave him legitimacy took it away. And yet Anne's legacy lingered. Though she bore no children, she brought Bohemian court culture to England, including a love of literature, architecture, and perhaps most consequentially, her patronage of scholars who would influence the early Reformation. Quietly, she altered the cultural DNA of the monarchy. Still, her presence in the lineage, a cousin, a queen, a consort without an heir, marked another closed loop in the genetic circle of Europe's royalty. And the pattern didn't pause. Because while Anne softened a king, the next monarch, Charles II, would take that same cousin bond and twist it into something far more scandalous. Not a queen, but a mistress, and not a marriage, but a dynasty of illegitimate cousins with titles. 17. Charles II. Charles II returned to England not on a white horse, but on a tide of exhaustion. The monarchy had been dead for over a decade, executed, quite literally, with his father. And in its place, a republic had risen, dragged itself through military dictatorship, and promptly collapsed under the weight of its own sanctimony. By the time Charles was invited back in 1660, people were no longer debating the divine right of kings. They were just tired of Puritanism, of regulations, of not dancing. So Charles, ever the opportunist, rebranded the monarchy not as a divine mandate, but as an entertainment franchise. His court was witty, debauched, cosmopolitan, and conspicuously tolerant of vice, including his own. He ruled with flair, kept Parliament guessing, and fathered more illegitimate children than any British monarch before or since. But perhaps most characteristically, Charles never wandered too far from the family gene pool. One of his most famous mistresses was also his cousin. Barbara Villiers, later styled the Countess of Castlemaine and then the Duchess of Cleveland, was a tempest in silk. Bold, shrewd, and dangerously beautiful, she rose from minor aristocracy to the inner sanctum of royal favor with a mix of unapologetic ambition and impeccable timing. And, importantly, shared blood. She and Charles were first cousins, once removed, through Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. It wasn't a scandal. It was practically expected. Barbara became Charles's mistress early in his reign, before his arranged marriage to Catherine of Braganza had even settled into ceremonial discomfort. Catherine, a Catholic Portuguese princess, brought trade routes and diplomatic headaches. Barbara brought conversation, drama, and children. 5 of them, all officially acknowledged by the king and all granted noble titles. Her influence at court was as undeniable as it was controversial. She secured pensions, positions, and privileges not just for herself but for her lovers and allies, creating a miniature kingdom within the king's bedchamber. To Charles, she was more than a mistress. She was a symbol of the Restoration's rejection of austerity, of the monarchy's return to personal rule, and of the royal family's unwavering habit of looking inward when choosing companions. Their relationship, far from being secret, was a public performance of royal preference and familial familiarity. But beyond the scandal sheets and Restoration comedies lies a deeper irony. Charles II, the king who modernized the image of the crown, who helped stabilize a fragile nation post-regicide, did so while quietly reinforcing one of the monarchy's oldest patterns, cousin relations as political theater. His family tree was already tangled with intermarriages from the Stuarts and Tudors, and he added another branch, unofficial, illegitimate, but unmistakably royal. The children Charles fathered with Barbara, including the Duke of Grafton and the Duke of Cleveland, were woven into the fabric of the aristocracy. They carried not just royal blood, but the genetic echo of centuries of internal union. Cousins of cousins, cousins once removed, cousins reinserted into the peerage with strategic grace. Charles never had a legitimate heir, and his brother James would inherit the throne by default. But Charles left behind something else, a map of dynastic indulgence. A living reminder that while monarchs may change crowns and costumes, the blueprint remains the same. Keep the power in the family, even if the family starts to resemble a hall of mirrors. And as the crown passed to James II, that mirror only cracked further, because James wouldn't just marry for politics, he'd marry within the family line itself. Again, and again. 18. Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine. Barbara Villiers was not born to be a duchess. She was born into minor nobility, raised in relative obscurity, and shaped by a world that expected women like her to marry acceptably and fade discreetly into the background of someone else's legacy. Instead, she carved her own, one torrid, calculated, and unapologetically bloodbound step at a time. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, Barbara was already waiting. Tall, striking, and entirely uninterested in decorum, she became his mistress just as the monarchy was re-establishing itself. In a court filled with gossip and indulgence, Barbara wasn't just tolerated, she was celebrated, envied, and feared. And she wasn't just another conquest, she was family. Barbara and Charles were first cousins, once removed. Their shared ancestor was Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. But in the Restoration Court, this wasn't considered particularly alarming. The monarchy had always favored cousin marriage, now it was just cousin seduction. And Barbara, with her lineage intact and ambition ablaze, knew exactly how to use that familiarity. She was married when she met Charles, to Roger Palmer, a Catholic aristocrat of limited consequence. But that was a technicality. The real union was with the king. Barbara moved into Whitehall Palace, raised eyebrows and temperatures in equal measure, and quickly began producing children. 5 in total, all officially acknowledged by Charles, who gave them titles, lands, and an irrevocable seat at the aristocratic table. What makes Barbara's story fascinating isn't just that she was the king's mistress or that she bore his children. It's that she did so with the full knowledge and advantage of their shared ancestry. Unlike many court favorites who were forced to hide or apologize for their proximity to the throne, Barbara flaunted hers. She used it as leverage. She was not only of the royal bloodline, she was contributing to its off-the-books continuation. Her relationship with Charles was, by all accounts, volatile. They argued, reconciled, plotted, and parted ways more than once. But her hold on him, and on the court, never truly faded. Her influence extended to political appointments, financial grants, and even policy nudges. Courtiers who crossed her did so at their own peril. She was not the quiet mistress. She was the royal cousin who knew her worth. What's more, Barbara's children by Charles, most notably Charles Fitzroy, later Duke of Grafton, weren't hidden away in shame. They were paraded, elevated, placed into the machinery of British aristocracy like legitimate heirs, even if they technically weren't. The bloodline, after all, was still intact, still royal, still cousin-approved. As the years passed and new favorites rose, Nell Gwyn, Louise de Querouaille, Barbara's influence waned, but never disappeared. She lived long enough to see her descendants secure titles, inherit lands, and marry into other noble families, extending the royal gene pool sideways even as the crown tried to march forward. Barbara Villiers didn't just exist within the royal story. She shaped it. As both lover and cousin, she symbolized everything the Restoration monarchy was trying to both escape and preserve: tradition, proximity, and the inability to look beyond its own bloodlines. And as Charles aged and the weight of succession grew heavier, the spotlight turned to his brother, James, a man far less charming, far more devout, and just as dynastically entangled. Because when it came time for James to choose his second wife, he didn't need to look far. She was already in the family. 19. James II. James II was never meant to be a seducer. He lacked his brother Charles II's charm, his wit, or his theatrical self-awareness. But what he lacked in flair, he made up for in certainty, religious, political, and familial. He was a man of conviction, a king of stubborn decisions, and a dynast whose most personal choices were written in the language of ancestral routine. So it comes as no surprise that when James married Mary of Modena, he chose, once again, a cousin. Not a close cousin, mind you. Mary and James were first cousins once removed, sharing a common ancestor in Charles I. But in the eyes of 17th century Europe, this was as normal as owning land or fearing the French. Royals didn't marry for novelty. They married for familiarity. And James, like every Stuart before him, preferred his bloodlines circular. James's first marriage to Anne Hyde had already entangled him with the nobility. Anne was no foreign princess. She was the daughter of Edward Hyde, one of Charles II's most loyal ministers. A scandal at the time, the union was legitimized only after Anne became pregnant. The marriage produced two surviving daughters, Mary and Anne, who would later rule as queens in their own right. It also marked James's early break with convention. He had married for obligation, not for ancestry. But his second marriage was a return to form. Mary of Modena was everything Anne Hyde was not. She was Catholic, continental, aristocratic, and, crucially, dynastically appropriate. At just 15 years old, she was married by proxy to James, then in his 40s, and whisked off to England to serve as both consort and dynastic chess piece. Their shared ancestry made the union diplomatically seamless, at least in theory. But in practice, it triggered a slow-moving political explosion. To a Protestant England, the union was dangerous. Not because it was a cousin marriage, that was largely unremarkable, but because it threatened to produce a Catholic male heir with unimpeachable royal blood. And in 1688, that's exactly what happened. Mary gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, immediately igniting rumors that the child was a fraud, smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. The logic was as paranoid as it was revealing. The idea of a legitimate Catholic heir born of royal cousins was less believable than a full-blown conspiracy. But James II's downfall wasn't just about religion. It was about his complete inability to read the political room. He was a Catholic monarch ruling over a largely Protestant kingdom, insisting on royal absolutism in an age when Parliament was sharpening its knives. His cousin marriage didn't help. It reinforced everything the public feared, a monarchy closed in on itself, recycling power through incestuous dynasties and foreign influence. By the end of 1688, James was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that replaced him with his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, also a cousin, naturally. James fled to France, where he lived in exile, clinging to the idea that bloodline alone could restore him. But the irony is dense. The very marriage that had produced the heir he so desperately wanted also sealed his fate. The crown had finally drawn a line, not against cousin marriage, but against the kind of closed-loop monarchy that refused to evolve. And yet, evolution was slow, because James wasn't the first monarch to marry a cousin, and he certainly wasn't the last. The tradition stretched back through centuries, and forward too. Just ask Mary of Modena, the quiet but resolute queen who followed the script so perfectly and passed it on. 20. Mary of Modena. Mary of Modena didn't ask to become the face of England's royal nightmare. She wasn't scheming, wasn't power-hungry, and wasn't even English. But in 1673, at the age of 15, she was sent from her Italian duchy to marry James, Duke of York, the future James II. A man more than twice her age, deeply unpopular with the English public, and already raising eyebrows for his unapologetic Catholicism. Their shared lineage? That only made things more combustible. Mary and James were first cousins once removed, both descended from Charles I of England, James as his son, and Mary through her mother, Laura Martinozzi, a niece of Cardinal Mazarin, who had intermarried into the extended Stuart dynasty. In other words, another marriage sanctioned not by love or even convenience, but by dynastic arithmetic. She was young, royal, Catholic, and genetically consistent with the royal family. She checked all the boxes, whether she knew it or not. Mary arrived in England as a nervous foreign bride, speaking little English and facing a court that was equal parts hostile and suspicious. From the moment she stepped off the boat, she was treated not as a princess, but as a Trojan horse for papal influence. Her Italian Catholicism made her suspect. Her youth made her seem manipulable. Her marriage to James, already known for his Catholic sympathies, turned her into a symbol of everything England was trying to avoid. And then she started having children. Her pregnancies were constant, her miscarriages frequent, and the pressure to produce a male heir unbearable. This was, after all, the late 17th century, where the fate of the throne, the church, and the entire Protestant order could hinge on whether or not a boy was born to a Catholic queen. For years, Mary's inability to produce a healthy son worked in her favor politically. The public tolerated her, warily, because it seemed she posed no lasting threat. Then, in 1688, everything changed. Mary gave birth to James Francis Edward Stuart, a healthy, living male heir to the Catholic King James II. The child's arrival should have been a dynastic triumph. Instead, it triggered one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in British history. The birth was immediately declared a fraud. Rumors spread that a substitute baby had been smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan, swapped for a stillborn or non-existent infant. That the Queen, foreign, Catholic, and too perfect in her timing, had faked the entire thing. It didn't help that Mary had few defenders at court. Nor did it matter that over 40 witnesses had been present during the delivery. The damage was done. Mary's cousin marriage to James, once a calculated act of dynastic continuity, was now reframed as a papist plot. Her baby was labeled an impostor. The monarchy unraveled. That same year, in what would become known as the Glorious Revolution, James was deposed by his own daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, also cousins naturally, and the entire Stuart household was exiled to France. Mary, for her part, carried herself with a calm that belied the chaos. She lived out her days quietly in Saint-Germain, raising her son and watching her legacy shift from queen consort to political ghost. But in the end, Mary of Modena was neither the villain her enemies imagined nor the queen her dynasty needed. She was, above all, another royal woman placed into a system that prioritized cousin marriage, repetition, and control. And like so many before her, she had been expected to produce heirs, preserve the bloodline, and remain silent. Still, the pattern endured. Her son would grow up believing himself the rightful king. And the family tree, twisted, splintered, yet still rooted in itself, continued to branch outward with the same familiar names. One of them was George I, who would inherit the throne not through charm or conquest, but by being just related enough. 21. George, I did not speak English. He didn't bother to learn it either. He arrived in Britain in 1714 wearing a powdered wig flanked by 2 mistresses and trailing a long paper trail of German titles that no one in London could pronounce. He had never set foot on English soil before being offered its throne, yet somehow he became king. Not because of conquest, charisma, or popular demand, but because of cousin math. George I was the great-grandson of James III of England, making him a descendant of the Stuarts through his grandmother, Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia. That placed him somewhere in the extended royal family buffet, not the nearest branch, but one of the few left standing after the Protestant succession laws took a sledgehammer to every Catholic claimant in Europe. By the time Queen Anne died in 1714 without a surviving heir, Parliament was desperate to keep the crown Protestant, even if it meant skipping over dozens of closer Catholic relatives to reach a German cousin who barely acknowledged their island. So, in true dynastic fashion, George was imported like fine porcelain, foreign, fragile, and expected to sit quietly on display. But behind the ceremonial trumpets and reluctant coronation was a familiar royal feature. He had married his cousin. George I's wife, Sophia Dorothea of Chalais, was his first cousin. A double cousin, depending on how you count. They were related through the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg, one of those sprawling German dynasties that seemed to specialize in marrying itself. The match, arranged when they were both teenagers, was less about romance and more about consolidating territory. Their union brought together two branches of the same house, strengthening internal alliances and, more importantly, keeping land and power within the family. But the marriage was a catastrophe. George and Sophia Dorothea detested each other almost from day one. George found her dull and inconvenient. She found him cold and self-absorbed. Both were unfaithful, though Sophia's affair with Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck became the stuff of Gothic legend. In 1694, after the Count mysteriously disappeared, widely believed to have been murdered with George's knowledge, Sophia Dorothea was imprisoned in Alden Castle, where she remained for the rest of her life. She was never crowned queen, never permitted to leave, and never forgiven. George, meanwhile, ascended to the British throne as a widower in practice. He never remarried. Instead, he brought his two long-term mistresses to court, known mockingly by the British public as the Maypole and the Elephant. It was a public relations disaster, but George didn't care. He ruled from a distance, physically, emotionally, linguistically, and left the heavy lifting of governance to his ministers. Still, the irony of his rise was unmistakable. The entire Protestant succession was built to avoid Catholic monarchs, like James II and his heirs, kings who had married their cousins, favored family over country, and ruled with a sense of divine entitlement. And yet here was George, Protestant, yes, but cut from the same dynastic cloth. He too had married within the family. He too had placed ancestry above affection. He too was the product of a system that preferred cousin marriage to risk. George Bush didn't need to understand English to understand the game. Keep the bloodline pure. Keep the marriage in-house. And above all, keep the crown in the family, even if it meant locking your wife away for 30 years. But Sophia Dorothea's story didn't end with exile. Her presence, or rather, her ghost, would continue to haunt the dynasty, because though she was hidden away, her blood remained in the line, and her name would return with the next monarch, her estranged husband's namesake son, who married, unsurprisingly, his cousin. 22. Sophia Dorothea of Chelles. Sophia Dorothea of Chelles was a duchess by birth, a prisoner by marriage, and a royal ghost by legacy. Her story is rarely told without a footnote, or a frown, or a passing shrug. After all, she never became queen, never ruled, and never escaped the barbed cage of dynastic marriage. But in many ways, she represents the most distilled version of royal inbreeding's quiet cruelty, married to her first cousin, cast aside like a political liability, and erased from history while her DNA marched on through the halls of power. Born in 1666, Sophia Dorothea was the only child of George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his mistress-turned-wife, Eleonore d'Amier d'Olbreuse, a noble woman of French Huguenot descent. Her parents' marriage had been morganatic, meaning it was technically unequal, and for a time it seemed Sophia would be excluded from high dynastic stakes. But when her father formally legitimized her and recognized her as his heir, she suddenly became very, very useful. At 16, she was married off to her cousin George Louis, the future George I of Great Britain. The match united two branches of the House of Hanover and was intended to consolidate wealth, territory, and titles. It did not, however, consolidate happiness. George was cold, blunt, and disinterested. Sophia Dorothea, intelligent and passionate, quickly grew resentful of a marriage that treated her as both asset and obstacle. They had two children, a daughter, also named Sophia Dorothea, who would go on to marry Frederick William III of Prussia, and a son, George Augustus, the future George II. These births sealed her usefulness, at least in the royal accounting ledger. But they did little to improve her standing with her husband, who continued to neglect her and pursue other women openly. By her early 20s, Sophia Dorothea found herself increasingly isolated at court. and when she rekindled a relationship with an old admirer, Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, her fate was sealed. Their affair was scandalous not just because it violated the rules of royal propriety, but because it threatened the illusion of dynastic control. A consort might be unloved, but she could never be unpredictable. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Most historians believe he was murdered, likely with George's knowledge or consent. Shortly after, Sophia Dorothea was divorced, technically for malicious desertion, a legal phrase as hollow as the marriage itself, and banished to Alden House in the Lüneburg Heath. There, she lived in de facto imprisonment for the next 32 years. She never saw her children again. She was not allowed to attend royal functions. Her name was rarely spoken in public, and when it was usually with disapproval. But she never recanted, never confessed, and never gave the dynasty the satisfaction of surrender. And yet, her blood continued to course through the monarchy. Her son became George II. Her descendants would sit on thrones across Europe. The very woman the crown tried to bury behind ivy-covered walls remained, genetically, legally, historically, central to the royal story. Sophia Dorothea of Shelley may have been cut out of the public record, but she was never truly erased. She lived on in portraits, in gossip, and in the irony of a system that feared her passion but welcomed her pedigree. Her husband, George I, ascended the British throne alone, but her influence, muted and silenced as it was, carried on through the child they produced together, a son who would follow the family blueprint just as faithfully. Because George II, heir to a dynasty built on cousin marriage, would do exactly what tradition demanded: find a cousin, marry her, and keep the loop going. 23. George II. George II, like so many monarchs born into this long-running family experiment, was not designed for novelty. He was designed for consistency, bred, selected, and educated to maintain a system already groaning under the weight of its own predictability. Born in 1683 to George I and Sophia Dorothea of Shell, who, we should recall, loathed each other and lived on opposite ends of a scandal, George II grew up as a walking symbol of dynastic endurance. His parents' cousin marriage had imploded in slow motion, but it had served its purpose. George existed. And when it came time for George to marry, he followed the script with mechanical precision. His bride, Caroline of Ansbach, was, naturally, his second cousin. The match, arranged in the way these things always were, offered several advantages. She was Protestant. She was of suitable rank. She was German. And, crucially, she was related. Their shared ancestry came through multiple noble lines, particularly via the House of Brandenburg-Ansbach and the interwoven tapestry of German Protestant royalty. George didn't need to love her. He just needed to not protest. And Caroline, clever and diplomatic, understood the assignment. To the surprise of nearly everyone, the marriage worked, not just politically, but personally. George and Caroline, while never a fairy tale, formed a genuinely close and effective partnership. He trusted her advice, relied on her judgment, and even tolerated her subtle manipulation of court politics. She, in turn, learned to manage his temper, translate his clumsiness into strategy, and balance her role as consort with her own political ambitions. But none of this escaped the genetic reality of their union. Their children, 8 in total, were bred not just for succession, but for dynastic continuation. Each of them carried the same narrowing bloodlines that had defined European royalty for generations. The family tree wasn't growing. It was folding, neatly and tightly, like a letter sealed with wax and repetition. George II's reign, from 1727 to 1760, was marked more by conflict abroad than intrigue at home. Britain was shifting into an empire, and George, ever the soldier, took a hands-on approach to war. He was the last British monarch to lead troops into battle, famously at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. But while he busied himself with military pageantry, it was Caroline who ruled the palace. She acted as regent in his absences, influenced appointments, and maintained a complex correspondence with philosophers, theologians, and politicians. Her role as queen consort and cousin was not passive. It was calculated. She knew exactly where she stood in the royal food chain and how to survive in it. When Caroline died in 1737, George was devastated. He reportedly visited her body often, weeping privately. Despite his blunt manner and public rigidity, he had loved her, or at the very least respected her far more than most royal husbands respected their wives. His grief was uncharacteristic, but his loyalty? Entirely on brand. She had been his cousin, his queen, and his institutional equal. George II himself died in 1760, leaving behind a monarchy increasingly strained by Enlightenment ideals and public scrutiny. But genetically, nothing had changed. The bloodline remained pure, in the royal sense, meaning repetitive, narrow, and tightly managed. And it would continue that way, because the next king, George III, would double down on respectability, on royal virtue, and, predictably, on marrying within the fold. His wife would be his third cousin. His children would inherit not just crowns and castles, but a gene pool that refused to admit outsiders. 24. Caroline of Ansbach. Caroline of Ansbach arrived in Britain as many royal women before her had, politically valuable, dynastically appropriate, and quietly related to the man she was expected to marry. Born in 1683, in the small principality of Ansbach in what is now Germany, she was a Protestant princess with a solid lineage and the kind of mind that was considered dangerous in any woman who wasn't wearing a crown. She was also, of course, related to her husband, George II. As his second cousin, Caroline fit neatly into the royal family's well-maintained genetic filing system. Their shared ancestry through German noble houses made the match a clean one, politically convenient, religiously acceptable, and biologically familiar. The marriage wasn't controversial. It was expected. But Caroline wasn't interested in being expected. Where many royal consorts were passive ornaments to a crown, Caroline was an operator. Educated, strategic, and fluent in 5 languages, she brought more than just a dowry and a recognizable surname to the British court. She brought an agenda. And for nearly 2 decades, she pursued it from behind the throne, often more effectively than those seated on it. Her marriage to George II was one of mutual tolerance that over time grew into something resembling genuine affection. George, famously brusque and short-tempered, relied on Caroline in ways that confounded his courtiers. She helped shape his public image, advised him on key appointments, and, most critically, acted as regent during his frequent absences. Her influence was never formal, but it was absolute. Even Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister, knew to check in with Caroline before assuming the king's mood. But behind the polished exterior was the familiar pattern of cousin marriage, a strategic recycling of royal blood, designed to prevent power from escaping the dynastic inner circle. Caroline, for all her intellect and cultural sophistication, was also a symbol of that continuity. Her children with George were born into the same closed loop that had defined Europe's ruling houses for centuries, breeding within to protect without. The couple had 8 children, several of whom would continue the practice of intermarriage with their own cousins or closely related nobles. Most famously, their son Frederick, Prince of Wales, would become a figure of dynastic tension, constantly feuding with his parents and representing a kind of generational rebellion. But even he stayed well within the family blueprint when it came to marriage. Caroline's presence at court also helped soften the image of the German-born Georges in the eyes of the English public. She sponsored hospitals, supported religious tolerance, within Protestant bounds, and cultivated the arts and sciences. She hosted philosophers, read controversial thinkers, and engaged in theological debates. And yet, despite all her modern flourishes, she remained firmly rooted in the oldest royal tradition. She was a cousin, married to a cousin, producing more cousins. Her death in 1737 devastated George II, who broke through his usually gruff exterior with open mourning. He insisted on being buried beside her, with the side of his coffin removable so that their remains could touch. It was oddly tender, perhaps the most vulnerable act of his reign. But sentiment did not undo structure. Caroline had done exactly what she was brought in to do. She had anchored a dynasty, delivered heirs, and maintained the loop, genetically, politically, and ceremonially. And as the crown passed to their grandson, George III, the blueprint held. He would marry not for love, not for novelty, but for symmetry. His chosen queen would be a third cousin, another carefully selected piece in the grand, slow-turning mechanism of royal continuity. 25. George III. George III is best remembered for two things: losing the American colonies and losing his mind. But before the Redcoats marched and the Regency Acts were drawn up, George was something else entirely. A textbook royal product of cousin marriage who doubled down on the same family values that had shaped the monarchy for centuries: duty, decorum, and dynastic recycling. Born in 1738, George III was the grandson of George II and Caroline of Ansbach, two second cousins who had done their part to keep the bloodline appropriately folded. George inherited their legacy in full: Protestant piety, German practicality, and a keen awareness that monarchs didn't marry for passion. They married for position. So when it came time for him to choose a wife, George made the most traditional, least controversial choice imaginable. He married his third cousin. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was German, Protestant, and suitably aristocratic, not too powerful to overshadow him, not too foreign to rattle Parliament, and just related enough to keep the family circle nice and tight. Their shared ancestry ran through several minor German princely houses, all tangled together by generations of intermarriage. By the time their match was arranged, no one blinked. Of course she was his cousin. Who else would it be? But George III, ever the contradiction, turned this calculated arrangement into a model of royal stability. Theirs was one of the rare royal marriages that appeared genuinely affectionate. They married in 1761 and had 15 children, yes, 15, creating an entire generation of Windsors who would go on to marry their own cousins in due time. Charlotte was devoted, patient, and content to stay behind the scenes. George, unlike many of his predecessors, never took a mistress. He was, in his own words, born for domestic life. Still, affection did not cancel out ancestry. Their children were not born into novelty. They were the next links in a well-worn genetic chain. And as much as George presented himself as a king of moral rectitude and national unity, his private life was a quiet continuation of the same system that had shaped every monarch before him. His marriage may have looked modern, but it was dynastically medieval. George's reign began with optimism. He was the first Hanoverian king born in England, the first to speak English without a German accent, and the first in decades to truly engage with his subjects as a native son. But his rule was tested early, by colonial rebellion, political instability, and eventually by the slow creeping fog of mental illness. His condition, likely exacerbated by a hereditary blood disorder, rendered him increasingly erratic in his later years. Though medical historians still debate the diagnosis, what's clear is that George suffered not just emotionally, but publicly. His private decline was transformed into national theater, the mad king who ranted at ghosts and shadows surrounded by doctors, advisors, and increasingly distant family members. But his bloodline endured, and so did the system that produced him. George III may have tried to be the moral monarch, the family man, the stabilizing force, but he was still the product of centuries of selective breeding, intermarriage, and familial insulation. His third cousin marriage was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint. And as his children grew up, the pattern deepened. Some rebelled, some complied, but most did what royal children were trained to do, marry within the fold. Especially his son Edward, who as Prince of Wales dabbled in scandal and distant cousin courtships, before settling eventually on a royal bride whose own lineage traced straight back to the family tree's increasingly tangled roots. 26. Queen Charlotte, Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz wasn't raised for a crown. She was raised to be useful, a quietly intelligent princess from a modest but respectable German duchy, plucked from the ranks of Europe's Protestant nobility and inserted into Britain's royal machine like a cog that no one expected to squeak. And like so many before her, she was selected for one overwhelming reason. She was the right kind of cousin. Charlotte was a third cousin to her future husband, George III, through shared ancestry in the tangled mess of German princely houses, specifically the House of Mecklenburg and the House of Hanover. Their connection wasn't scandalous. It was ideal. She was noble, Protestant, apolitical, and genetically familiar, just the way the British crown liked its queens. The marriage was arranged with brisk efficiency. Charlotte arrived in England on September 8, 1761, met George for the first time that same day, and married him just 6 hours later. There was no courtship, no romantic overture, and certainly no surprises. But what might have been a cold transaction turned in time into something rare, a genuinely warm and enduring partnership. Charlotte, though shy in public and overshadowed by the political drama of her husband's reign, exerted quiet influence from behind palace walls. She was well educated, fluent in several languages, and devoted to the sciences, music, and botany. She corresponded with intellectuals, supported the arts, and helped establish the royal family as patrons of culture and moral stability. Her court was comparatively modest, more duty than decadence, and her presence helped reinforce George III's carefully curated image as a domesticated king, loyal, moral, and above all, respectable. But her greatest legacy, as always in royal terms, was reproductive. Charlotte gave birth to 15 children, 13 of whom survived into adulthood, and thereby guaranteed a steady stream of Windsor heirs and marriages for decades to come. Each of these children was, of course, a living expression of the cousin match that had created them. And most would go on to marry their own relatives, keeping the bloodline comfortably self-contained. While Charlotte's marriage is often remembered for its stability and emotional depth, a rare pairing in royal history, it was also deeply emblematic of the monarchy's genetic tunnel vision. Her selection as queen wasn't based on chemistry or character. It was based on a spreadsheet of ancestry, religion, and political neutrality. She was Protestant. She was not French. She was not Catholic. She was not controversial. She was, simply, correct. Yet Charlotte wasn't without complexity. Rumors have swirled for centuries about her possible African ancestry due to her descent from a distant Portuguese noblewoman of mixed heritage. These theories, while debated and often overstated, have added a layer of historical curiosity to her image, especially given the irony that Britain's imperial queen may have carried a trace of ancestry that her empire often treated with disdain. But the crown, focused as always on lineage over nuance, didn't ask those questions. In the end, Charlotte did what was required of her. She married a cousin, bore heirs, kept quiet, and kept the monarchy running. She was the embodiment of the royal blueprint, a queen selected for her DNA as much as for her demeanor. And her children would carry on that same pattern, each assigned a role in the dynastic machinery. Most notably, her son Edward, Duke of Kent, would do his duty not just to the throne, but to the family tree. His romantic record was complicated, but when it came time to marry, he stayed in bounds. His bride, of course, was also family, because the pattern always loops back to itself. 27. Edward VII, as Prince of Wales. Before he became King Edward VII, he was simply Bertie, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and heir apparent to the throne for an exhausting 59 years. He was born into a household governed by moral rigidity and Germanic order, and from the moment he arrived in 1841, he was expected to uphold everything his parents stood for: duty, restraint, tradition, and of course, marrying the right cousin. Edward's life, however, did not unfold according to his parents' script. Where Prince Albert was studious and solemn, Edward was restless and distracted. Where Queen Victoria was devout and controlling, Edward was social and incorrigibly curious. And where his parents dreamed of a politically spotless, genetically disciplined future for the monarchy, Edward became a case study in dynastic flexibility, though not without maintaining the family's favorite tradition, marrying within the bloodline. In 1863, Edward married Princess Alexandra of Denmark, his second cousin, linked through the ever-widening web of European royalty. Their common ancestor, King George II, ensured that the union was as genetically legitimate as it was politically strategic. Alexandra was the daughter of Christian IX of Denmark, a monarch whose children would go on to marry into nearly every major European house. Known as the father-in-law of Europe, Christian was exactly the kind of patriarch the British royal family approved of: Protestant, royal, and cousin adjacent. The match was publicly celebrated and personally complicated. Alexandra was elegant, poised, and well-liked, but Edward, ever the wayward son, was far from a faithful husband. His extramarital relationships, many with women distantly related through shared noble ancestry, were a source of constant anxiety for the court and unending disappointment for Victoria. Yet even in his private rebellions, Edward rarely stepped too far outside the family tree. His lovers were often aristocrats, and often cousins in one form or another. But his marriage to Alexandra, for all its personal tensions, accomplished what it was meant to. It preserved dynastic continuity. The couple had 6 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood, and their bloodlines threaded through the heart of European royalty. Their son, the future George V, would later marry his own second cousin once removed, a woman who had initially been betrothed to his brother. Because in this family, when one cousin dies, you simply assign another. Edward's public image shifted significantly once he became king in 1901. After decades in his mother's shadow, he emerged as a diplomatic heavyweight, known for his charm, his travels, and his carefully curated affability. But beneath the surface of his Edwardian sophistication was the same dynastic logic that had governed royal marriages for centuries. His marriage, his mistresses, his children, all of it stayed comfortably within the noble framework. And like so many royals before him, Edward VII's story was less about choice than about continuation. Even his supposed scandals followed a pattern. His personal indiscretions rarely challenged the system. If anything, they reinforced it, reminding the public that while kings may wander, their heirs still came from the same familiar stock. And when his eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, entered adulthood, the pattern nearly repeated with eerie precision. He was engaged to marry the same woman his brother eventually would. And yes, she was a cousin too. Because in this family, even broken engagements loop back to the bloodline. 28. Alexandra of Denmark. Alexandra of Denmark was the royal equivalent of a stabilizing chemical, elegant, composed, and introduced into the British monarchy not to disrupt it, but to prevent combustion. She married into the royal family at a time when its internal dynamics were both highly combustible and strictly choreographed. And she married, as expected, a cousin. Born in 1844 to Christian IX of Denmark and Louise of Hesse-Kassel, Alexandra was, from the beginning, part of Europe's dynastic core. Her father was nicknamed the father-in-law of Europe, not as a metaphor, but as a practical observation. His children married into the British, Russian, Greek, and Norwegian royal families. These weren't diplomatic arrangements dressed up as fairy tales. They were interlocking dynastic gears grinding in perpetual motion, and Alexandra was one of the most crucial cogs. Her marriage to the future Edward VII in 1863 was more than a romantic headline. It was a calculated joining of Protestant bloodlines. Alexandra and Edward were second cousins, both descended from King George II, and their union was vetted as much for political compatibility as for genetic familiarity. This wasn't just monarchy, it was maintenance, keeping the bloodline within its own orbit while satisfying Parliament, Victoria, and the wary British public. Alexandra was 18 when she arrived in England, wide-eyed but well-trained. Her role was clear: marry the heir, produce heirs, and keep her opinions limited to embroidery and charitable causes. And for the most part, she did. But she also brought a subtle intelligence to the role that often goes unrecognized. Behind the reserved smile and the carefully practiced British accent was a woman who understood how to survive in a house built like a labyrinth. Edward was never faithful. That was known from the beginning. His affairs, numerous, sometimes shameless, included actresses, aristocrats, and at least a few women who were also related to him through one ancestral vine or another. Alexandra, however, never wavered publicly. She was dignified, distant, and absolutely untouchable in the court of public opinion. If Edward's romantic life was a scandal, hers was a sanctuary. She gave birth to 6 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood, ensuring that the dynastic line was not just preserved, but multiplied. Her son, the future George V, would carry on the family tradition by marrying Princess Mary of Teck, his second cousin once removed and the former fiancée of his brother. In this family, when one engagement fails, another is penciled in before the ink dries. But Alexandra's influence was more than maternal. She shaped fashion trends, spearheaded hospital initiatives, and cultivated a public image so polished that even her critics softened. Her slight Danish accent became endearing. Her limp, the result of a childhood illness, became a copied gesture among upper-class women desperate to appear aristocratically delicate. She never spoke publicly about Edward's infidelities. She didn't need to. She held the court together by being the one thing it lacked: steady. When Edward ascended the throne in 1901, Alexandra became queen consort. By then, her role was ceremonial, but her influence remained quiet and constant. She embodied a monarchy that insisted on both moral projection and private flexibility, one that could overlook affairs, ignore emotional distance, and embrace cousin marriages, so long as the public face remained intact. And that face would pass to the next generation, quite literally. Her son's engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, his deceased brother's fiancée and his own cousin, would ensure that the bloodline stayed exactly where it had always been, in the family. 29. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Prince Albert Victor was supposed to be a king. The eldest son of Edward VII and Princess Alexandra of Denmark, he was born into expectation, a future monarch molded from centuries of lineage, legacy, and carefully measured bloodlines. But instead, he became a royal echo, a prince who never ruled, a fiancé whose bride married his brother, and yet another Windsor woven tightly into the fabric of cousin marriage that had come to define the monarchy. Born in 1864, Albert Victor, or Eddie as he was known to his family, was the product of dynastic symmetry. His parents were second cousins, descendants of George II, and his very existence was a genealogical promise. The monarchy would continue, predictably, neatly, and preferably within itself. But even by royal standards, Eddie's ancestry was particularly knotted. Through both his father, Edward VII, and his mother, Alexandra of Denmark, he descended from several shared royal houses. And when it came time to choose a bride, the palace didn't look far. The preferred candidate was Princess Mary of Teck, herself already a double second cousin to Albert Victor. Through Queen Victoria on one side and King George III on the other, the match was an intricate tangle of interwoven family lines, as close to dynastic recycling as one could get without causing alarm. In 1891, the engagement was announced. Mary of Teck, dignified and quietly intelligent, was the perfect consort. Well-bred, Protestant, and related just enough to make the match comforting. It was the ultimate expression of royal strategy. A future king marrying a cousin who had been practically raised for the job. No surprises, no risk. Just another loop in the hereditary spiral. But that spiral never completed. In January 1892, just weeks before the wedding, Albert Victor died suddenly of pneumonia, likely brought on by influenza. He was 28. The palace, and the public, were stunned. The mourning was swift and theatrical. Black crepe flooded the court. Bells tolled. Queen Victoria, never a woman of half measures, sank further into her familiar cavern of grief. And Princess Mary? She became an emotional widow without ever having married. But the monarchy, ever practical, found a use for her still. 18 months after Eddie's death, Mary became engaged to his younger brother, Prince George, the future George V. The logic was seamless. Same bride, same bloodline, same dynastic intent. The engagement was both a tribute and a correction. The plan had faltered, not failed. Albert Victor's legacy thus became strangely invisible. He left no children, no reign, no monument beyond a tomb in Windsor and a trail of what-ifs. And yet his engagement, short-lived as it was, revealed the monarchy's deep commitment to familial consistency. Even in death, his role was fulfilled by a brother. Even in mourning, the cousin marriage went ahead, just with a different cousin. Speculation swirled for decades around Eddie's intelligence, his character, his rumored vices, and his mysterious associations. But none of it mattered in the dynastic ledger. What mattered was that he had been born from the right blood, engaged to the right cousin, and replaced by the right sibling. And Princess Mary of Teck? She wasn't just a replacement fiancée. She was a dynastic constant, a woman trained from birth to marry into royalty, no matter which cousin it ended up being. And when she did, she would carry that tradition forward, marrying George V and ensuring that cousin marriage remained not just a precedent, but a legacy. 30. Victoria, Princess Royal. Victoria, Princess Royal, was born into the most scrutinized and structured family in Europe, the first child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and the living embodiment of what happened when first cousins designed their children with the precision of engineers. From the moment of her birth in 1840, she was destined to be more than a daughter. She was a symbol of unity, of dynasty, and above all, of continuity within the royal bloodline. Her parents, themselves first cousins, had grand plans for her. Prince Albert, ever the strategist, saw in little Vicky the perfect opportunity to expand British influence across Europe by exporting Victorian values, Protestant piety, and royal genes in equal measure. But instead of marrying her into some distant neutral court, he chose a cousin. Naturally. At the age of 17, Victoria married Prince Frederick William of Prussia, her second cousin. The two shared a common ancestor in King George III, and the match was greeted with satisfaction by royal genealogists across the continent. It was politically advantageous, culturally respectable, and genetically familiar. The marriage wasn't just personal, it was policy. The wedding, held at St. James's Palace in 1858, was a spectacle of imperial optimism. British pride met Prussian ambition. And beneath all the ceremony, the central message remained clear. The dynasty would continue, safely enclosed within itself. Unlike many royal matches, Victoria and Frederick's marriage was actually affectionate, even idealistic. They shared intellectual pursuits, liberal political leanings, and a genuine belief in constitutional monarchy. She admired his character. He admired her mind. It was, by Victorian standards, practically revolutionary. They had 8 children, the most famous of whom was Wilhelm II, later Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. And this is where the genetic symmetry turns bitterly ironic. The son of a British princess and a Prussian prince, Wilhelm grew up straddling 2 empires, 2 cultures, and one incredibly complicated family tree. Victoria raised her children with British sensibilities, liberalism, constitutionalism, and a certain stiff-lipped moral code. But she was in Berlin, not Buckingham, and the German court had little patience for foreign influence, even when it came from a cousin. Her efforts to modernize Prussian royal culture were met with resistance, her English manners mocked, her political views dismissed. When her husband finally ascended the Prussian throne as Frederick III in 1888, his reign lasted just 99 days before he died of throat cancer. Victoria became the Dowager Empress, sidelined, scorned, and estranged from her increasingly authoritarian son. Wilhelm II rejected her influence, distanced himself from her English heritage, and eventually led Germany into a world war against the very cousins who had once been his playmates. And yet, through it all, Victoria remained the royal constant, the British princess who had married her cousin, produced more cousins, and tried to bridge empires through the subtle power of shared blood. Her life was both a triumph of dynastic planning and a tragedy of misplaced optimism. Because in the end, it wasn't war that unraveled the royal families of Europe. It was proximity. Too many marriages between too few families. Too much sameness disguised as strategy. And Victoria, Princess Royal, stood at the center of that web. A daughter of first cousins, a wife to a second cousin, and the mother of a dynasty that would one day collapse under the weight of its own inheritance. Her sister, Princess Alice, would continue the pattern, marrying into yet another branch of the family and passing on both royal genes and royal fragility to the next generation. 31. Princess Alice, daughter of Victoria. Princess Alice was Queen Victoria's second daughter, born in 1843 into a family obsessed with bloodlines, manners, and the long-term logistics of monarchy. Where her elder sister Victoria, the Princess Royal, had been raised as the future queen of somewhere, Alice was assigned a slightly different purpose, a dynastic bridge. Someone who would quietly marry a cousin, produce heirs, and keep the royal web spinning smoothly from one generation to the next. And so she did. At age 19, Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, her first cousin once removed. He was a decent match by royal standards. German, Protestant, modestly powerful, and importantly, family. Their shared ancestry, like most royal unions of the era, wasn't a mere coincidence. It was a feature, not a bug. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, both first cousins themselves, actively encouraged marriages between their children and their wider network of Germanic relations. Alice and Louis fit neatly into that arrangement. No awkward genetics, no unpredictable alliances, just more tightly looped blood. The wedding, held in 1862, was unusually subdued. Alice's father, Prince Albert, had died just months earlier, and the court was still drenched in mourning. Victoria, deep in grief, refused to attend the ceremony. Alice was given away by her brother Edward instead, her marriage folded into the shadows of familial duty. But Alice wasn't merely an obedient daughter or a passive duchess. She was thoughtful, intellectual, and emotionally intuitive. She corresponded with scientists, read widely, and was one of the few members of the royal family who showed an active interest in nursing, hygiene, and social reform. Her work during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, nursing wounded soldiers and organizing medical supplies, was praised for its compassion and practicality. It also raised a few eyebrows. For a woman of her rank, care work was considered dangerously hands-on. Still, her most enduring legacy would not be her charity, but her children. 7 in total, born across the turbulent years of her marriage. And it's here that the royal gene pool, already narrowed by design, began to show its flaws. Alice was a carrier of hemophilia, the blood disorder that would come to haunt the royal houses of Europe. It's believed she inherited it from her mother, Queen Victoria, who may have developed a spontaneous mutation or carried a dormant gene. Either way, it was passed down, and Alice, unknowingly, became one of its most tragic conduits. Her son, Friedrich, Fritti, was diagnosed as a hemophiliac in infancy. In 1873, he died at age 2 after a fall caused internal bleeding that could not be stopped. It devastated Alice. The loss marked a shift in her already fragile emotional health, as well as her understanding of just how vulnerable royal bodies could be, even in palaces. But fate wasn't finished with her yet. In 1878, diphtheria swept through the Hessian court. Several of Alice's children fell ill. She nursed them herself, refusing to leave their bedsides, ignoring medical warnings. She caught the disease in the process. After weeks of illness, she died on December 14th, the anniversary of her father's death, at just 35 years old. Alice's story, like so many royal women, was about proximity, to power, to illness, to the ever-tightening circle of inherited fragility. She was both a daughter of cousins and a mother to more of the same. And while her legacy is often framed in maternal sacrifice, it's also a story about what happens when a family repeats its pattern for too long. One of her daughters, Princess Alex, would marry into another royal house, Russia's, and pass along that same hemophiliac gene to her only son. But before that next tragedy unfolded, Alice's sister Helena would continue the family's quiet tradition. She too would marry within the circle. Another cousin match, another dutiful loop in the great genetic spiral of British royalty. 32. Princess Helena, daughter of Victoria. Princess Helena, Queen Victoria's fifth child and third daughter, was not destined to be a queen or a political chess piece or the center of any great drama. She was instead built for maintenance, reliable, dutiful, and expected to do what royal daughters so often did: marry a cousin, produce a lineage, and disappear into history as a quietly successful footnote. Born in 1846, Helena was raised with the same combination of emotional distance and intellectual oversight that marked all of Victoria and Albert's parenting. She was practical, serious-minded, and according to her mother, not especially beautiful, which in the royal matchmaking market was the equivalent of being told to stay within your weight class. Fortunately, there was never any real question of looking outside the family tree. When it came time to choose a husband, the answer was already in the bloodline. In 1866, Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, a minor German royal who was both conveniently Protestant and, more importantly, her second cousin. The match was neither glamorous nor ambitious. In fact, it was met with mild resistance by parts of the British court, who considered Christian too obscure, too German, and too dependent on British royal patronage. Queen Victoria, however, approved, largely because Christian posed no political threat, and, crucially, allowed Helena to remain close to home. Helena and Christian's shared ancestry came via the tangled Germanic noble lines that interwove across Europe. The House of Schleswig-Holstein was closely connected to the Danish royal family and had multiple blood ties to both the British and Prussian courts. In short, he fit. The marriage was not one of high romance, but it was stable. Helena, like her mother, preferred control to passion. She took her role seriously and dedicated herself to public service, nursing advocacy, and charitable work. She was one of the founding members of the British Red Cross and became president of the Royal British Nurses Association, causes she pursued with real engagement, not just ceremonial obligation. Still, the quiet success of her marriage didn't change its function. It was another royal loop in the family's genetic continuity. She and Christian had 6 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood, and their marriages continued the tradition. Her daughters married into other German houses, extending the familial reach without ever breaking the cousin-based formula. Helena remained a close companion to Queen Victoria throughout her life, a fixture in the royal household, loyal, efficient, and largely obedient. While some of her siblings were sent across Europe to secure grand alliances, Helena was kept near Windsor, a reminder that some royal daughters weren't expected to make history, only to help it continue. Her children were raised in this same ethos: service, structure, and intra-familial loyalty. Helena didn't challenge the system. she preserved it. Her marriage to Christian didn't alter the course of European politics, but it did precisely what was required. It kept the royal family insulated, interrelated, and intact. And if Helena was the quiet enforcer of that tradition, her youngest sister would become its final echo in Victoria's direct line. Princess Beatrice, the baby of the family, would marry a cousin too, but hers would be a love match, at least on the surface. Still, the bloodlines matched, and in the end, that was all that mattered. 33. Princess Beatrice, daughter of Victoria. Princess Beatrice, the youngest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was born into a palace already arranged, both genetically and emotionally. By the time she arrived in 1857, the family routine had solidified into a kind of ceremonial choreography. Speak properly, marry strategically, and don't stray too far from the family tree. Beatrice never had a chance to do otherwise. She was Victoria's favorite, which, in the royal lexicon, meant she was also Victoria's possession. From an early age, Beatrice was designated not as a dynastic emissary like her elder siblings, but as her mother's personal companion, the child who would remain unmarried at her side forever. Queen Victoria, still deep in mourning for Prince Albert, referred to Beatrice as baby long into her adulthood and expected her to serve as secretary, confidant, and emotional caretaker. In return, Beatrice's independence was quietly erased, but the family script had a loophole. Beatrice fell in love, or at least found someone acceptable to love. His name was Prince Henry of Battenberg, a minor German prince, conveniently royal, acceptably Protestant, and, most importantly, a second cousin. His mother, Princess Julia of Battenberg, came from the same web of German nobility that had threaded itself into nearly every corner of Victoria's family tree. Beatrice and Henry shared descent from the House of Hesse, a line already folded multiple times into the British royal bloodstream. Victoria objected to the marriage, not because of the bloodlines, those were fine, but because of the logistics. If Beatrice married, she might leave, and the Queen couldn't bear that. Eventually, a compromise was arranged. Beatrice could marry her cousin, so long as she and Henry lived with the Queen. Forever. The wedding took place in 1885, shadowed by royal sulking. Victoria refused to speak to Beatrice for months leading up to it, only resuming conversation on the day of the ceremony. But once the marriage was formalized, the Queen adjusted, with conditions. Prince Henry was given the style Royal Highness, but was kept on a very short leash. When he joined military expeditions abroad, Victoria panicked. When he later died of malaria while serving in Africa, the Queen's grief was tinged with something colder, as if Beatrice had broken a pact. Beatrice, now a widow with 4 children, doubled down on duty. She continued serving as her mother's personal secretary, transcribing thousands of pages of Queen Victoria's journals, editing, redacting, and shaping the monarch's legacy with a careful hand. She remained a loyal daughter to the end and a quiet enforcer of the family's genetic policy. Her children inherited the usual burden: royal names, reduced status, and the expectation to marry suitably. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, later Queen of Spain, would carry the hemophilia gene, inherited from Beatrice, inherited from Queen Victoria, and pass it on to the Spanish royal family. The pattern never ended. It just changed scenery. Princess Beatrice was the last of Victoria's children to die in 1944. By then, the world had already started to burn through monarchies, cousins, and empires. But her life stood as a final note in a symphony of repetition, one more carefully selected cousin marriage in a family that had always looked inward and almost never outward. And though the Victorian age had ended, the genetic logic of royalty would continue, crowned, preserved, and politely replicated. Because the royal family wasn't just a dynasty, it was a loop,